It didn't start with shouting. It didn't start with betrayal. It started with a sentence said so casually that no one noticed it cut deeper than anger ever could. We were sitting in my parents' living room, the same room where birthdays were celebrated and apologies were never spoken, when my mother laughed and said, "You're good at handling things. That's why we don't worry about you." Everyone nodded. And just like that, my exhaustion was rebranded as reliability. In that moment, I understood something I'd avoided for years. They didn't depend on me because they loved me. They depended on me because I made their lives easier. And the day I stopped doing that, everything they believed about our family began to collapse. My name is Rachel Miller. I was 33 years old when I finally realized I wasn't a daughter in my family. I was a system. On the outside, my life looked stable. I lived alone in a modest apartment outside Chicago. I worked remotely as a project operations analyst. Not glamorous, not flashy, but consistent and well paid. I paid my bills on time. I didn't ask for help. That last part became my identity. In my family, needing nothing meant being assigned everything. I wasn't the favorite. I wasn't the problem child. I was something quieter. I was the one people leaned on without ever asking how heavy the weight felt. The Millers looked functional from the outside. My father, Thomas, had spent his life working logistics for a regional distribution company. He believed stability was the highest form of success. My mother, Elaine, believed harmony mattered more than honesty. My younger brother, Kevin, was charming, impulsive, and permanently figuring things out. My older sister, Melissa, had a family of her own and a talent for emotional distance disguised as busyness. And then there was me, the dependable one, the flexible one, the one who didn't need much. That phrase followed me everywhere. Rachel's fine. Rachel understands. Rachel can handle it. I handled it because no one else wanted to. The first time I stepped in financially, it felt temporary. Kevin had missed a rent payment after quitting another job. My parents were stressed. I transferred money and told myself it was a one-time thing. It never is. Then it was utilities, then car repairs, then just until he gets back on his feet. My parents never asked directly. They implied. An implication is harder to refuse than demand. When I covered costs, things stayed calm. When I hesitated, tension appeared. So I learned to move quietly. I became the person who fixed things before they became emergencies. I coordinated payments. I handled paperwork. I made calls no one else wanted to make. When my parents downsized their house, I managed the logistics. When Kevin needed help negotiating debt, I handled it. When Melissa needed just a little support during a tight month, I adjusted my own budget. No one called it sacrifice. They called it being responsible. And responsibility in my family was a one-way street. At family dinners, conversations flowed around me, not toward me. Kevin talked about his next idea. Melissa talked about her kids. My parents talked about expenses and worries. When I spoke, people listened politely, then moved on. No one asked how I was doing, because I never looked like I was struggling. I had trained myself not to. It happened during an ordinary Sunday visit. Coffee was cooling on the table. The TV murmured in the background. Bills were spread out in neat piles. My mother smiled and said it casually, almost proudly. "We're lucky Rachel doesn't need much. She's always got things under control." Everyone agreed. And suddenly, I saw it clearly. My strength had become their excuse. Their comfort had become my obligation, and no one planned to change that. I didn't argue. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't make a speech about boundaries or fairness. I just made a quiet decision. I would stop anticipating their needs. I would stop filling gaps before anyone noticed they existed. Not to punish them, but to see what would happen when I stopped holding everything together. That decision felt small. It wasn't. It was the beginning of the end of the version of me they were comfortable using. The first thing I noticed after I made my decision was how uncomfortable stillness made everyone else. I didn't announce boundaries. I didn't explain myself. I simply stopped being proactive. When Kevin missed a payment, I didn't step in early. When my mother mentioned stress, I listened instead of fixing it. When Melissa hinted at needing help, I didn't offer solutions. Nothing dramatic happened at first, just pauses. And in those pauses, anxiety began to surface. Problems that had always been absorbed quietly started appearing in the open. Late notices arrived. Phone calls went unanswered. Tension crept into conversations that once stayed polite. My parents didn't say my name right away. They danced around it. They talked about how things were tight, how everyone was struggling, how families should support each other. They were waiting for me to step back into position. I didn't. Families like mine don't notice change until it disrupts comfort. They assumed I was busy. They assumed I'd circle back. They assumed I'd always do what I'd always done, because people don't expect systems to opt out. I wasn't angry. That confused them more. Kevin called one evening, his tone forced casual. He talked for several minutes without saying anything meaningful. I listened. Eventually, the silence did what I wouldn't. The truth slipped out. A job had fallen through. A payment was overdue. Things were complicated. I acknowledged it. I didn't solve it. The call ended awkwardly. For the first time, my absence was felt instead of assumed. Without me absorbing the weight, it redistributed. My parents argued more. Melissa grew distant. Kevin became defensive. And slowly, carefully, the tone toward me changed. Concern turned into irritation. I was described as less available, then distracted, then quietly selfish. I recognized the pattern. When usefulness disappears, appreciation follows. My mother tried first. She framed it as worry. She talked about age, health, uncertainty. She reminded me how much the family had done for me. It wasn't malicious, it was learned behavior. Guilt was the tool she used when fear didn't work. I listened without reacting. That silence unsettled her more than resistance ever had. Distance gave me clarity. I realized I'd been confusing love with obligation for most of my life. I thought being needed meant being valued, but need is not the same as care. Care asks, need assumes, and my family had assumed I would always be there, not because they believed in me, but because I made life easier. Weeks passed. Issues piled up. No one fixed them quickly anymore. My name began to surface openly in conversations, not with warmth, but expectation. Why isn't Rachel helping? She's always handled this. This isn't her like. They weren't asking how I was doing. They were asking why I wasn't functioning. One night, sitting alone in my apartment, I felt something unfamiliar. Peace. No urgent messages, no financial spreadsheets, no emotional labor disguised as love. Just quiet. And in that quiet, I understood something important. I wasn't abandoning my family. I was finally choosing myself. They thought my distance was temporary. They thought pressure would pull me back. They underestimated how exhausting it had been to be invisible while holding everything together. They didn't realize that once someone stops carrying a weight, they don't rush to pick it up again. They wait, and waiting was something my family had never learned how to do. The structure was unstable now, not because I broke it, because it had always depended on someone who never agreed to be the foundation. The collapse wasn't loud yet, but it was inevitable, and when it came, they wouldn't be able to pretend it was sudden. The collapse didn't arrive with shouting or slammed doors. It arrived through accumulation. Bills that couldn't be delayed, decisions that couldn't be postponed, problems that required answers instead of avoidance. Without me absorbing impact, everything hit at once, and for the first time, my family had to face the weight they'd been distributing quietly for years. Kevin's situation worsened faster than anyone expected. Temporary setbacks became permanent ones. Short-term solutions stopped working. Excuses ran thin. My parents scrambled, trying to patch holes with optimism and denial. Melissa withdrew completely, overwhelmed by pressure she'd never been expected to carry before. The structure had depended on a single constant, and that constant was gone. My name resurfaced, not as an assumption, but as a solution. Not emotional, not apologetic, functional. They didn't ask how I was doing, they asked if I could step in. That distinction mattered. When we finally sat together, the room felt smaller, not because of tension, because illusions had collapsed. I listened as they explained urgency, stress, responsibility. I didn't interrupt, I didn't defend myself. When they finished, I said something simple. I wasn't stepping back into a role I never agreed to take. Silence followed, not confusion, recognition. For the first time, they saw me without function attached, not as support, not as backup, not as a safety net, as a person with limits. That shift unsettled them more than anger ever could. They realized something too late. They hadn't raised a helper, they had raised a human being and treated her like infrastructure. People imagine moments like this as triumph. They're wrong. It wasn't satisfying, it was grounding. I didn't feel powerful, I felt aligned. For the first time, my presence was optional, not assumed. That changed everything. The dynamics didn't magically heal, but they adjusted. Requests became questions, expectations softened, conversations slowed down. They stopped assuming access to my time, my energy, my resources, and I stopped offering them automatically. Respect replaced convenience. I didn't move closer, I didn't distance myself further. I stayed exactly where I was, grounded, independent, whole. Because boundaries aren't walls, they're definitions. I wasn't abandoned, I wasn't rejected, I wasn't selfish, I was finally honest, and honesty when introduced into systems built on assumption feels like disruption, but it isn't, it's correction. Some families confuse love with access. They reward availability and punish independence, until one day the quiet one steps back, and everyone realizes how much they were holding without being seen. Not to punish, not to prove anything, but to finally live unburdened.